Right, so let's look at part 2 of this verse, and the first angels, which says, saying with a loud voice, fear God and give glory to him, for the hour of his judgment has come, and worship him who made heaven and earth, the sea, and the springs of waters. As we discussed earlier, there's a lot of messages out there that are kind of full of hate and like fear, is trying to scare people into Christianity. A surface reading of this almost appears to support that idea. Is that the approach we should take, or what is it actually talking about here when it says to fear God?
Yeah, I think a lot of people take this literally because it doesn't just say fear God. It says fear God and give glory to him, for the hour of his judgment has come.
Yeah.
And there's a lot of people that run around terrified
Yeah.
about the judgment. Am I going to measure up? Am I going to be good enough? Am I going to be accepted? What's going to, am I going to make it in when my number comes up? And so, people definitely read this and it fills them with like literal fear. One of the things for me that has really helped me understand this is like, if you think about Isaiah in chapter 6, right? He comes face to face with God, and his response is, woe is me. I'm a man of unclean lips. I'm undone. I'm done. I'm dead. Even John, when God appears to him in Revelation, at the beginning of Revelation, he falls down as one who is dead, right? So there is this magnificence about God that when we come face to face with him, when we see him for who he is, it should, I think, elicit a certain amount of fear.
Yeah.
But the call is always after that, don't be afraid.
Yeah.
And so Isaiah falls down. He says, I'm unclean. I can't be here. I'm going to die. And then an angel comes and says, here, let me cleanse you.
Yeah.
And that's the good news. I mean, that's what it is that,
right.
that we don't have to be afraid of God. We may initially respond in fear, but the call is always don't be afraid.
Yeah. He doesn't want us to be afraid of him. And, also like Moses, when he sees God, right? He comes down and the people are just blinded, like what's happening. They found themselves afraid, whereas Moses was much closer to God than they were. And so he knew that he didn't have to be afraid.
Right.
There was that idea of reverence. People freak out today if you meet someone famous or whatever like that. Like if you think about actually meeting and talking with the person that created everything. I mean...
And has the power to recreate everything if he wants to, right?
Yeah, definitely.
Yeah.
And so it's that idea of awe, right?
Yeah,
that idea of reverence.
And I think of synonyms, and I'm glad you brought up awe. There's reverence, there's wonder. And all of those kind of bring about a picture of what happens when you're in the presence of God. Yeah. You recognize that he is God and that you're not. Yeah. And in there's this wow, but there's also wow, he wants me. He wants this relationship with me. So I don't have to be afraid of him. And I love 1 John. Later on, he talks about that perfect love casts out all fear. Yeah. When you recognize that this powerful God that is in front of you doesn't want to destroy you, but wants to love you, that does cast out all fear, and it actually brings about who God actually is, which God is love.
Yeah, it's incredible that who he is, and that is his character, right? As you said, John, it says that he who does not know God does not know God, because God is
He who does not love does not know God, for God is love.
There we go.
There we go. That is a
that's the verse. That's the verse, right?
Yeah.
And it's interesting, like the love chapter, 1 Corinthians 13, right? It gives all these different characteristics of being kind and patient and all these things, and this is who God is. But what's interesting is we often focus on that, but the verses before that, it says like prophecy, it says all of these gifts, all of these, if you could know everything, you could be able to prophesy, you could be able to do all this stuff, but if you didn't have love, it's worthless. And if you think about the lines that it gives, the only person that can do all the things that is said there is God. So he's almost saying that he himself would be nothing without that character of love. Like that's the foundation for everything. So of course he doesn't want us to be afraid of him, but to recognize who he is.
Yeah. And I think it's important, talking about like 1 Corinthians, 12 and 13, right? Is that you have this idea in 1 Corinthians 12 that there's these gifts, there's these things that the Spirit is going to empower you to do. And the challenge there is, and I think why Paul makes that turn there, is that there's a danger in starting to become too confident in what I'm doing and thinking that what I'm doing somehow is meriting something for me.
Yeah.
And so Paul's reminder here is like, it doesn't matter. You could speak with the tongues of angels. You could have all knowledge. You could prophesy. But if you don't have love, you have nothing.
Yeah.
And I
Clinking
think
cymbal, right?
yeah.
Yeah.
You're just noise.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And so, to me, when you think about that in relationship to what John is saying here, in fear God because the hour of his judgment has come, we see here like that we have to be really careful to not get it twisted and start thinking about somehow there's things that we've done that have gotten us to a place where we can justify our standing in the judgment, because it's just the inverse, right? This fear of the judgment comes from feeling like I haven't measured up. And so it all comes down to keeping ourselves in right relationship to God. And one of the passages that is very significant for me, if you were to say, Wes, what's the one passage that encapsulates the gospel for you? It's 2 Corinthians 5, 14 through 21. We'll just look at 21 for what I want to bring out here. But it says, for our sake, he made him, that's talking about Jesus, to be sin, who knew no sin, so that in him we might become the righteousness of God. Yeah. And so, in the last episode, we were talking about the gospel and the significance of this. So when we come now, and this is just a continuation of the same thought, right? It's not two separate thoughts, is that when we come into the judgment, we're not coming in based on anything that we've done. If we've accepted Jesus, he stands in our place. Yeah. And this exchange that's here in 2 Corinthians 5:21 is that, Jesus, and this is the beauty of it for me, Jesus did not have to sin to become sin.
Yeah.
No.
This was a supernatural thing that God did.
Right.
And so if the juxtaposition there is now Jesus became sin, who knew no sin, that we might become the righteousness of God. So what righteous works do we have to do to be righteous? So then when we come to the judgment, what is the determining factor in the judgment?
Right.
And so for me, this turn begins to happen. We may come in fearing the judgment. We may be coming in afraid of God because we don't know what's going to happen at the end. But as we get a picture of the gospel, we begin to hear this word, do not be afraid. Why? Because the judgment isn't based on what I've done, but in whom I've believed.
There we
Absolutely.
go.
And then it leads us into this idea of what is worship, right? Worship flows out of this in that because we have come to understand and we begin to awe after God, it fills us with this sense of awe, it fills us with this sense of wonder. Now the fear of God becomes this positive thing in our life, and it begins to lead us into something else.
Yeah. Well, all this all ties in together. So the awe and the wonder of giving doxa, giving glory unto God, which then leads into this worship. Like he alone is worthy to be worshipped.
Right.
Yep.
And we see a definition here of worship with this proskuneo. And I love this because the simplest terms, my kids love this imagery, but it's as a dog coming to lick his master's hands, bowing down.
Interesting.
Right? You can see
Yeah.
this physical imagery of what it means of bowing down and worshiping the one who's worthy to be worshipped.
That's amazing. I'm glad you know how to say that word because I haven't taken Greek yet. But that expressing the attitude or that position, that recognition of allegiance to God, and there's. As we're talking about Revelation, obviously we're talking about we don't need to be afraid. There's that idea of recognizing him, but we're also not saying that life isn't crazy, that there's not things that are happening in the world, that there's not
there's
this
temptations,
stuff.
there's everything around us.
And so when we talk about the idea of fear and that connection with God, it reminded me of Hebrews 11:7, which says this: by faith, Noah, being divinely warned of things not seen, moved with godly fear, prepared an ark for the saving of his household. So he was certainly in a crazy time, right? And it wasn't, just chill and relaxed. There was a lot of things happening. There was a flood coming, right? But he trusted God, and he has this ark of safety, and that's the beauty. I think that's the message that we see within Revelation, is recognizing who God is, because he is our ark of safety. No matter what craziness happens around us. It reminds me of one of my favorite books in the Bible. It's hardly ever looked at, or sometimes people forget it exists, but it's the book of Habakkuk.
Oh, yeah.
And the reason...
Which one's that?
What is that? Where is that?
Bless you.
What I love about it is, like, he's at a rough spot.
Yes.
He's being ripped from his home, and his initial answer to his prayer is not ideal. And you think, man, this is just a rough spot. But what's crazy is he ends the book with this like quote of praise and of faith and of victory. Like he's still being dragged from his home in chains. Like, but now all of a sudden he's claiming victory, and that message is kind of in the heart of that he starts to recount the things that God has done. He starts to recount who God is, and that allows him to recognize that God's going to bring him through. It doesn't matter what's happening around him. And so he ends up in that relationship of trusting him, even though the circumstances that surround him are a little crazy. He doesn't have to be afraid. He can trust him fully.
Yeah. I think that you think about like Proverbs 1 verse 7, it says, the fear of the Lord is the beginning of knowledge. Mm-hmm. As we get to understand who God is, and we begin to understand the new world that we live in because of what he's done for us, and we claim it by faith, it begins to change our perspective on how we relate to things happening in our life. And this is one of those verses that gets really, misused, misinterpreted, misrepresented. But, in Romans, where it says that all things work together for good for those who, are called.
According to his, yeah.
Thank you.
Yeah.
And so we take that and we say like, oh yeah, no, all things are gonna be good. And so then we try to say like, oh, this terrible thing that's happening to you is a good thing. And it's not that the terrible thing is a good thing. No. That's not the thing at all. Like that's not what we're trying to say. And that's not what Paul's trying to say. What he is trying to say is that when we have a bigger picture, when we begin to understand what it is, when we have the knowledge of what God is doing in the world, we understand that what is happening right now is temporary. And we may face tribulations, we may face persecutions, but this is not the end. And so whatever this is, right, somewhere down the line, God is going to use it for good. He's not going to make that good if someone is abused, if someone is raped, if someone is treated as less than, if someone is enslaved, if you lose a loved one, it's not that that's good and we should say, oh, this is good, but that somewhere down the line, God is going to take that and he's going to bring something good out of it because he's pulling all things together. And so nothing is lost. Right. And so when we begin to fear the Lord, we begin to have this recognition for what he's doing. It changes the way we see things.
I recently heard a pastor who preached on something very similar. He just said, God is not the cause of your pain and suffering, but he will never waste it. Right. So he will help you to understand it and see it and help someone else who might be going through something similar. And that same passage you use, all things happen for good. Other people take that and they'll say, well, because I'm not good, that means bad things are happening to me as well. And that nothing could be further from the truth.
Right.
If you look at the life of the disciples, all of them were martyred, except for John, and he was boiled in a vat of oil, and then he wrote this book of Revelation on an island in Patmos, right? Isolation. But all of them would choose to do it over again because what seems like is happening is bad. Eternally, everlasting, it is great. It is fantastic because they have a relationship with God. And even though bad things are happening to them in the midst, they say we gladly take this because we've experienced the end of the beginning of that fear of wisdom, which is the end is love. And it's the love of God and being enraptured inside of God's love.
I don't think we can move on from this without really digging into worship and some of the reference that's there, because this begins to tie into that in that how is it that we can experience these things, us to a lesser degree, but what you're talking about with the disciples, when you look at the martyrs, I think of Huss and Jerome, and I can't remember which one was the one that recanted and then recanted his recantation. Because he just he couldn't face death, and then after he didn't face death, he's like, no, kill me. I can't live like this. This is what it is, right? It comes from this otherworldly place, and I think that when you look at the referencing there in this passage about worship and specifically what it's calling us to, we begin to understand a little something about what worship becomes and how that reframes our mind. So when we come into this passage here of worship him who made the heavens, the earth, the seas, and the springs of water, what is that calling us to? Let's bring that out for a minute. And then
that idea of acknowledging, because some people are like, oh, is just God this guy that hangs up there and he just has to have your worship, it's not that, it's that acknowledgement, it's that relationship, right? And recently my dad's not a Christian. We were talking about this earlier. He has a very very unique set of beliefs. But every once in a while, he'll say something that kind of, rings in my ear, and I can't get rid of it out of my mind. And he comes up to me and he says, the problem with Christians is they worship Satan. I was like, what are you talking about? And he's like, every time I talk to one, all they talk about is Satan. And I was like, it's not, it's so, it's not, well, it's not totally off, but that idea of acknowledging of, who are we talking about more? Who are we acknowledging more in our life? Are we giving that credit to the enemy, or are we giving that credit to God? And that's that relationship, that entering in, right?
Well, right here at the end of that scripture is talking about God as creator.
Yeah.
And that's why we worship him. Like, we wouldn't be here without God.
Yeah.
He sustains us.
Yeah.
He is the reason not only are we were here, but we are continuing to be here.
Yeah.
And because of that and that alone, we can worship him. Yeah. Not including the fact that he is involved in our everyday to-day lives.
Yeah.
And so there's if we could count the reasons why God is worthy to be worshipped, we can't count that high.
Yeah.
Right? My kids love the term Google, right? Like, it's actually a number. Well, we can't count all the ways that God is worthy to be worshipped.
Yeah.
Yeah. I think and we were talking about this the other day, that when you look at this passage here, we see this reference to creation, right? Him who created the heavens, the earth, the sea, but you don't see either in the creation story or the commandment in Exodus that this seems to be directly referencing this springs of water, right? So there is this thing, right, that there's this idea that, we just have to worship God because he's the creator. And yes, but this idea of springs of water in Scripture, the springs of water are the substance. It's the sustaining action of God, right? So you think about like the Israelites in the wilderness, right? Moses struck the rock, and then Paul references that in Corinthians. He talks about the stream of water that followed them, right? So whether that was literal or metaphorical, God followed them and provided for them through the 40 years in the wilderness. And so our worship is not just derived from the fact, well, he created us and then whatever's happening is happening, but that we begin to see that he's also sustaining us. He's caring for us. And that starts to take the burden off of us and allow us to just rest in him and trust him for what he's doing for us, and begin to understand that not only did he create us, but he provides.
Yeah, he supplies that. I used to kind of wonder about it talks about the tree of life. Like, well, why is it this fruit or this tree that's providing eternal life, and trying to figure that. But like, what's interesting in the description of it is the water flows from the throne, right? All of that life support, it comes from God, right?
Yes, it
is. And so that key of he is our sustainer, he is our redeemer, he's all of those things, and that's remarkable. And as you're alluding to creation and to Exodus, I think that brings up an important thing to help us know how to read Revelation is, and correct me if I'm wrong on this, I believe 2/3 of Revelation is all quotations from older past, from the Old Testament, that's a lot of the book, right? And so, I think about it kind of like, if you look at a movie that establishes a storyline, right, and then they show a small clip of it later on, when you see that clip, you know the context, right? You
make the connection.
You make that connection. And so Revelation is doing that throughout, the entire book. I mean, 2/3, that's a lot. That's a lot of it, right? Some would say that we shouldn't spend time reading the Old Testament, but like, if we don't, we're not going to be able to understand Revelation.
Understand the New Testament, right?
Yeah, that's right. Yeah, so when we're looking at this verse, it ties us back into creation, right? And into this time of the Sabbath, which is this time of resting, this time of relationship with him. And I find that really, really interesting that it's pulling us back to that. We're always trying to think of what is it that I'm supposed to do, right? And oftentimes his answer is that he wants us to rest in him and to rest with him.
Yeah, I think that's really interesting. Is we're about to kind of change gears from the first angel into the second and third angel, and it starts talking more about Babylon and the beast. That we realize that like what God is setting up here is this idea of trusting him and resting him. And what is worship? Worship is can be described as serving, but what is the service that God requires? He requires us to rest in him. He wants us to trust him and just settle in to that. And that paints like an interesting picture that I think we'll come back to as we get into the third angel down the line, and the fact that there is no rest for those who worship the beast.
Oh, yes.
And so I'm excited to get to that part.
Yeah, I think this is a good time to just recognize that this is an invitation for us to enter into that rest, of entering to that relationship. God has done his part, and he's calling us, beckoning us, pleading with us to please just come spend some time with me. Find yourself once again in my presence.
Yeah. Such a great promise that he has for us.
It is.
Yeah.